Good day. So this is part 2 of our lecture discussion for the nervous system. The central nervous system. It consists of your brain and your spinal cord, and your brain is being protected by a brain case. So from the superficial part or from the outer part, you have your skull. Going in, you will see the dura mater. You have an arachnoid mater, a subarachnoid space. You have a pia mater, and then once you remove the pia mater, you will now be able to see the surface of your cerebrum. So for your spinal cord, it is found inside your vertebral column. It has rootlets of the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves, you have your spinal cord, and then the lower part, you will see the cauda equina. So for the spinal cord, it extends from the foramen magnum to the second lumbar vertebra. It is protected by a vertical column, and then your spinal nerves allow your movement. If damaged, paralysis can occur. So don't be confused about the difference of your vertebral column and your spinal cord. So again, the gray matter and white matter in your spinal cord. So the gray matter is the center of your spinal cord. If you check it under the microscope, it looks like letter H or in the shape of a butterfly. And for the white matter, it is found outside of the spinal cord and it contains myelinated fibers. So the white matter in the spinal cord, it contains 3 columns. You have the dorsal, ventral, and your lateral columns. So you can see there the ascending tracts. These are where the axons that conduct action potentials towards the brain, and you have your descending tracts. This is the track wherein you see the axons that conduct action potentials away from the brain. So the gray matter has posterior horns. These contain axons which synapse with the interneurons. It also has an anterior horn which contains a somatic neuron. It also has lateral horns that contain autonomic neurons and a central canal which is fluid filled, and it is found at the center of your cord. So this is actually how it looks like. So outside, you will see there that on the white matter, you have the dorsal column, this one. You also have a ventral column and then a lateral column. So that's the white matter. And then for the gray matter, you will see here a posterior horn, a lateral horn, and then an anterior horn. And then at the bottom or at the middle, you will see here your central canal. So at the sides, you will see the dorsal root. You have your rootlets, okay, from the body of your cord, you will see first your rootlets, and then you will see a dorsal root. You have a dorsal root ganglion, and then a ventral root, and of course the spinal nerve corresponding to it. Okay. So for the cross section of your spinal cord, the second image shows you the relationship of the sensory and motor neurons to the spinal cord. So here, the spinal nerve, you see here the sensory neuron, the dorsal root ganglion, and then how it synapses with your autonomic and your somatic neurons. Okay, so it goes on your gray matter. So the spinal nerves arise along spinal cord from union of dorsal roots and ventral roots. They contain axons, sensory and somatic neurons, and they are located between your vertebra, categorized by the region of vertebral column from which it merges. For example, C for cervical. So there are 31 pairs and organized in 3 different plexuses. So first one would be your cervical plexus. These are the spinal nerves from C1 to C4. So it innervates the muscles attached to the hyoid bone and the neck. And it contains phrenic nerve, which innervates your diaphragm. Next, you have your brachial plexus. So it originates from spinal nerves C5 to T1, and then it supplies the nerves to the upper limb, the shoulder, and your hands. Okay. So the color that you see here on the image, for example, for C5, it's violet, so it's more likely that innervates the shoulder. For the elbow part, it's the C6 plexus or the nerve, and then for your wrist, you have C7 and C8, and T1 would be for your hands. So for the brachial plexus, you see here that they are subdivided into nerves, trunks, divisions, cords, and of course the branches. So for the nerves, again, you see here the C5 to T1 nerves, and then they have trunks, and then they have branches like your dorsal scapular, and then for the trunks you have the subclavius. For the divisions, you can see the suprascapular, and then the medial pectoral, and then you have the USS, MBC. Okay, and then for the cords, you have your lateral pectoral, and then for the branches, you have the musculocutaneous, axillary, radial, median, and then the ulnar branches. So just maybe memorize about how or which part of the body does this brachial plexus innervates. Okay, no need to maybe memorize the nerves, trunks, division, and cords. Just remember how are the brachial plexuses identified based on their innervations. Okay. And then next you have your lumbosacral plexus. For the lumbosacral, it originates from the spinal nerves L1 to S4, and it supplies the nerves of your lower limbs. So if you see here on the image on your screen, you see here the iliohypogastric nerves. The lumbar plexus is from L1 to S4, and so the outgoing nerves that you see there are the iliohypogastric, ilioinguinal, genitofemoral, lateral femoral, cutaneous nerves, the lumbosacral, and then the femoral nerves, obturator nerves, inguinal nerves. So with the names of the nerves also, you will know which part of the lower body it innervates. Okay, and then you also have your femoral nerves, the muscular branches, and then the femoral nerve cutaneous branch. Okay, so that's what you call the lumbosacral plexus. So this actually shows you how or which level of the cervical vertebra innervates the different levels of your body. So the corresponding colors for the cervical nerves would be the blue parts, okay? And then the violet one would be for your T1 to T12 or the thoracic, so more likely on the mid part of your body. And then the lumbar corresponds to the red color found kumbaga sa inyong lower part of the body, and then the white part or the flesh part, no, more likely they are innervating some parts of at the back of your lower limbs, and of course your genitals. Okay, so just please remember on which are included on the different types of the plexuses, like your cervical plexus, which levels of your vertebra are included, so which parts are or can be innervated by them. Okay, so this is the summary of the plexuses of the spinal nerves. So just be familiar with the plexus, their origin, and of course the major nerves that are found and which muscles are innervated. So for example, for cervical plexus, you have C1 to C4. The major nerve is what you call your phrenic nerve. So what they innervate is the several neck muscles and of course your diaphragm. And then the other, for the brachial, you have axillary, radial, musculocutaneous, ulnar, and median. And then for lumbosacral, you have your obturator, femoral, tibial, and common fibular. And then lastly, you have the coccygeal, which is from S5 to the coccyx. Okay, they don't have a major nerve, but they do innervate the pelvic floor of the muscles. Next, you have your cerebrospinal fluid. So this is the fluid that bathes the brain and the spinal cord. It provides a protective cushion around the CNS, and it is produced in the choroid plexus of the brain. Okay? So this is actually how your spinal fluid is being produced. So first, you have your CSF, which is produced by the choroid plexuses of each of the 4 ventricles. So here, this one, you will see here the choroid plexus of your ventricles. Okay. So in your ventricle, so the CSF from the lateral ventricles flows to the 3rd ventricle. So this part. So it flows outward. And then the CSF flows from the 3rd ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct of the 4th ventricle. And then the CSF exits the 4th ventricle through the openings of the wall of the 4th ventricle and enters the subarachnoid space. And some of the CSF enters the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay. And then the CSF flows through the subarachnoid space to the arachnoid granulations in the superior sagittal sinus, where it enters the venous circulation. So just make sure to memorize how the cerebrospinal fluid is made and how it circulates the brain. Okay. So this is the circulation of your cerebrospinal fluid. So again, the CSF is produced from the choroid plexus of each ventricle in this part. Okay, and then CSF flows through the ventricles and into the subarachnoid space via the median and lateral apertures, and some of the CSF flows through the central canal of the spinal cord. So this is the second part. And then CSF flows through the subarachnoid space. So this is the subarachnoid space. Okay. And then the CSF is absorbed into the dural venous sinuses via the arachnoid villi. So this one. Okay. So it travels from here, from the lateral ventricles. It can go down, and then it can cross the central canal, and then it goes on the other way, going to the subarachnoid spaces, or it can go this way and this way. And then some of them, okay, they can go out to the arachnoid villi and goes out. So next, let's go to the brainstem. So the brainstem has components of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So that's what you call your brainstem, this part. Okay. So for the medulla oblongata, it is located, it is continuous with the spinal cord. The function is for the regulation of heart rate, blood vessel diameter, breathing, swallowing, vomiting, hiccuping, coughing, sneezing, and balance. So the others, you will see that it also have what you call the pyramids. These are involved in the conscious control of your skeletal muscles. And then next, for the pons, this is above the medulla. It is bridged between the cerebrum and your cerebellum. The function is for breathing, chewing, salivation, and swallowing. Next is the midbrain, which is above the pons. The function is for coordination of the eye movements, the pupil diameter, and turning head towards noise. Okay, so it actually catches your attention when there's noise. And then you also have what you call your reticular formation. So these are scattered all throughout the brainstem. And the function is for the regulation of cyclical motor function, respiration, walking, chewing, arousing, and maintaining consciousness. It also regulates your sleep-wake cycle. So next, you have your diencephalon. So the diencephalon, this one. Okay. So the diencephalon is located between the brainstem and your cerebrum. And the components are your thalamus and hypothalamus. So the thalamus is the largest portion of your diencephalon, and it influences moods and detects your pain. And then epithalamus It is found above the thalamus, and its function is for emotional and visceral responses to odors. And then hypothalamus, it is located below the thalamus. It controls pituitary gland, and it's connected to it by the infundibulum. And it controls homeostasis, body temperature, thirst, hunger, fear, rage, and sexual emotions. So this is the anterior and posterolateral view of your diencephalon. So if you see here that the thalamus on the anterior view, you have your diencephalon here at the top. It includes the infundibulum is here at the middle. So the middle part is here. You have your pons, this one, and then the medulla oblongata below. And then again, the brainstem includes your midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And then for the posterolateral view, it looks like this: thalamus, the pineal body. Pag posterolateral, sinabi sa bandang likod. Okay? So, sa likod, you will see there the pineal body. You will see their colliculus. You have the superior and inferior colliculus. And then you have the cerebral peduncles at the back of your pons. And then you have here your thalamus. And then your interthalamic adhesion. So, kapag kinat nyo yung brain sa gitna, ito yung makikita nyo. Okay? So, you also have the hypothalamus, the mammillary body, the optic chiasm. You have the infundibulum here, which holds your pituitary gland. And then you have your diencephalon at the middle. And then you have your corpus callosum. You have the epithalamus at the back. And then below you have the pineal body, and then at the back is the cerebellum. So the thalamus, if you remove the thalamus at its place, it would look like this. So it has thalamic nuclei and interthalamic adhesion. Okay. So next is the cerebrum. So this is the largest portion of your brain. It has divisions, the right and the left hemisphere, and it is separated by what you call your longitudinal fissure. So this part is your longitudinal fissure. And then this is the right hemisphere, and then this is the left hemisphere. So the lobes, you have your frontal lobe, and then you have your parietal lobe, and then the occipital lobe, and then your temporal lobe. Okay, so the temporal lobe is here. So the cerebral cortex is actually the surface of the cerebrum, and it is composed of the gray matter. Its function is for the control of thinking, communicating, remembering, understanding, and initiates involuntary movements. So you see there that it has different folds. That's what you call your gyri. These are the folds on your cerebral cortex that increases the surface area. You have your sulci, or the shallow indentations. And then you have the fissures, which are deep indentations. And then the left hemisphere is actually noted to control the right side of the body. So it's contralateral. So the left controls the right, and then the right controls the left. So it is responsible for math, analytics, and speech. And then for the right hemisphere, it controls the left side of the body, responsible for music, art, and abstract ideas. So kapag magaling kayo sa math, so more likely the left hemisphere of your brain is more likely working than the right side. But if you're the type of person that loves music and has art ideas all of the time, so mas prominent yung inyong right hemisphere of your cerebrum. And then your right and left hemispheres are actually connected by two in between by what you call your corpus callosum. Okay, so this is your cerebrum at the top. Okay, so the fish, you have here your gyri, yung parang kulubot, and then sulci, yung mga singit-singit nyo, or the spaces in between. And then you also have your what you call your fissures. So again, in between, you have here your corpus callosum, which connects your right and your left hemispheres. And then your cerebrum at the back. Okay, and then you have your midbrain, you have the pons, and then the medulla oblongata, which comprises your brainstem. And then, of course, the diencephalon for your thalamus and your hypothalamus. So for the lobes of the brain, you have your frontal lobe. The location is, of course, found at the front. Its functions are for voluntary motor functions, aggression, moods, and smell. For the parietal, this is on the top. It evaluates sensory input such as touch, pain, pressure, and temperature or taste. For the occipital or the back, the function is more on the vision. Kasi guys, kapag sa occipital part, alam nyo ba na ang optic nerve, siya lang yung nerve sa brain natin na lumalabas sa likod. Okay? Sa likod ng ulo. So, the other cranial nerves, iba yung nilulusutan nila, di ba nga may mga foramen sa skull, yun. But for the optic nerve, paikot siya, from the back, no, paikot siya paharap. So, kaya siya, ang function niya is more on the vision. Kaya nga minsan, kung masakit minsan yung ulo nyo, and it has something to do with your eyes, kunwari, yung mata nyo ay hindi maganda, di ba minsan nararamdaman nyo na yung pain na nararamdaman nyo is nasa mga occipital side of your head. Okay? And then you have your temporal lobe, which is found on the sides of your brain, and they are for hearing, smelling, and your memory. Okay? Okay, so in your brain, there are also what you call margins or sulci. So for the frontal lobe, and for the separation of the frontal lobe and your parietal lobe, you have what you call your central sulcus here. Okay? But for the separation of the frontal, parietal, and your lateral and occipital lobes, okay, from the superior to the posterior parts of the brain, you have here what you call your lateral fissure. Okay, so in some models, these parts are very napapansin talaga. They are the features of the brain na mapapansin mo talaga when it comes to the separation of the different lobes of your brain. Okay, so for the cerebellum, the location is below your cerebrum. So it means little brain. And then the cortex is composed of your gyri, sulci, and gray matter. And then the function is for the control of balance, muscle tone, coordination of fine motor movements. So the sensory function, CNS constantly receives sensory input. We are unaware of most of our sensory input, and sensory input is vital for our survival and normal functions. So we also have what you call, again, di ba yung kanina, the sensory signals going to the brain. We call this your ascending tracts. So these are pathways in the brain and the spinal cord where signals are transmitted or information are transmitted by the action potentials from the periphery or from the sides of the brain going to from the sides of your body going to your brain. And then each tract has limited type of sensory input like temperature, touch, pain, etc. So these tracts are named that they indicated the origin and their termination, and they are made up of 2 to 3 neurons in sequence. So this is an example of the ascending tracts of the spinal cord. So in the anterior or ventral view, you have here what you call your dorsal columns, the posterior spinocerebellar tracts, anterior spinocerebellar tracts, anterior spinothalamic tracts. Okay. So for the dorsal columns, here you have your somatic cortex. How are they transmitting action potential? So with the dorsal column, so this is dealing with the touch, position, and pressure. So the lines on the inset indicates the level of their section. So the dorsal column, okay, so from the receptor, it goes to the first neuronal pathway, and then lateral to the medulla oblongata, and then it tas lumilipat siya sa kabila, contralateral to the second neuronal pathway, to the pons, to the midbrain, and then going to the thalamus, and of course, the somatic sensory cortex. Okay, so guys, with this one, yung mga levels of or the different pathways, it is not necessary for you to know them yet as of the moment because ito talagang pinag-aaralan to sa medicine. Okay? But then we are just giving you the idea of how this different tracts do actually work. Okay? Kung mapapansin nyo dito, bakit ganon? Kunyari, di ba nakikita nyo sa picture na nasa left side nag-umpisa yung receptor pero lumilipat siya papunta sa kanan. So, ganun yung mga nangyayari sa mga transmission ng action potentials. Hindi ibig sabihin na kapag na-receive mo ang isang stimulus sa kaliwa ng katawan mo, kaliwa na rin ng utak mo ang gagana. Minsan, meron tayong may mga, ito, katulad na itong mga pathway na to, neuronal pathway na naramdaman mo yung stimulus sa kabila pero kabilang side ng brain mo yung gumagana. Okay? So, may mga ganong side kasi guys kapag ang neuronal pathway ay nasisira, for example, because of injury, kunwari, nagkaroon ng accident, tapos natamaan yung pathway na yun sa spinal cord mo, okay? It would actually give you diagnosis kung ano yung part of the brain na naapektuhan, what level of your spinal cord was injured kasi magkakaroon ng difference when it comes to your sensation. Like for example, this dorsal column, it is for touch and position and pressure. So for example, if somebody punches you on the left side of your body pero wala kang naramdaman, it just means that there's a problem with your spinal cord or your brain. Okay, maybe a part of a level of your dorsal column or a level of your spinal cord or brain is damaged. Okay, meron tayong tinatawag na lateral and contralateral. Pag sinabing lateral, kung saan nagkaroon ng injury, even the functions of the brain, dun mo siya mararamdaman. Pero kapag contralateral, yun yung sinasabi na sa kabila nangyari yung injury, pero kabila ng brain or spinal cord mo yung nag-work dun sa function na yun. Okay, so those are how your neuronal pathways actually work. Okay, depending on the sensory receptors or sensory signals that they do actually receive. Okay? So, for the ascending tracts, you have actually your spinothalamic, which is for pain, temperature, light touch, pressure, tickle, and itch sensation. So, you also have your dorsal column, proprioception, touch, deep pressure, and vibration. You also have your spinocerebellar, which are anterior and posterior. So, they are for proprioception to the cerebellum. So, medyo, I know that this ascending tracts or descending tracts are very difficult. We just want you to understand how these different tracts work. Okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean na talagang aralin nyo siya for at this time because it will be very difficult for you to understand in this level how they work. But at least you know how ascending tracts work. Of course, they are stimulus or action potentials from the peripheral of your body sa gilid going to your brain. Okay? And then that there are different pathways of the ascending tracts depending on the function. Okay? And then sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So we have your primary sensory areas where ascending tracts project and where sensations are perceived. So primary somatic sensory cortex is the general sensory area in the parietal lobe, and its sensory input is for pain, pressure, and temperature. Next, you have your motor areas of the cerebral cortex. So you have your primary motor cortex, which is the frontal lobe. It controls voluntary motor movement. And then for premotor area, it is also in the frontal lobe where motor functions are organized before initiation. And then we have the prefrontal area. This is for motivation and foresight to plan and initiate movement. Okay, so with your cerebral cortex, there are different functions already. Okay, so sa frontal lobe pa lang, you already have your primary motor, premotor area, and prefrontal areas. So this is an image of the sensory and motor areas of the lateral side of your left cerebral cortex. So here you see primary motor cortex for the lower limbs, the trunk, the upper limb, and the head. Okay, so you also see here your premotor areas as assigned and in colors and directed by the arrows. And then you also have your prefrontal area. You have your motor speech area here at your temporal. Okay, this is what you call actually your Broca's area. So yung mga area na ganito guys, meron tong corresponding numbers. Okay, so later on we will know more about that. And then you have your auditory association area as well. And then you have your taste area here. You have your visual association. See that the visual cortex and visual association are more likely found at the occipital part of your brain. And then you have also here on your temporals, the sensory speech or the Wernicke area. You also have the somatic sensory, primary somatic sensory, and of course the central sulcus. Okay. So the descending tracts, these project from the upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex to the lower motor neurons in the spinal cord and the brainstem. So this control different types of movements. So here you have the descending tracts of the spinal cord. So you have the different types of descending pathways. You have the lateral corticospinal, rubrospinal, anterior corticospinal, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, tectospinal. So depending also on the level of your spinal cord, doon nyo lang makikita yung mga designated positions nila. Okay? So this is an example of a direct tract or of a descending tract. Okay? So you have here the neuromuscular junction of the lower motor neurons. You have interneurons, you have lateral corticospinal tract, and then it contralaterals, tumatawid siya sa kabilang side to the pyramids of the medulla oblongata, going up to the pons, upper motor neuron, the midbrain, and then the motor cortex to your brain. Okay? So depending on the level of your spinal cord and depending on where where the stimulus comes from, okay, doon sa pathway na yun, magta-travel yung action potentials. Okay? So the descending tracts actually are this one. You have the direct, so lateral corticospinal, so for muscle tone, skill movements. You have also the anterior corticospinal, so the muscle tone and movements of the trunk muscles. You also have the indirect ones like the rubrospinal, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, and tectospinal. So just be familiar with the name of the pathway and their basic functions. Okay? So this is actually how proprioception naman happens, okay, when it comes to the different pathways. So one, you have the motor cortex that sends action potentials to lower motor neurons in the spinal cord. So this one. You have the motor cortex, and then the action potentials from the motor cortex inform the cerebellum of the intended movement. So this one, number 2. And then number 3, the lower motor neurons in the spinal cord send action potentials to the skeletal muscles, causing them to contract. So number 3, this one, at the level of your spinal cord already. And then number 4, proprioceptive signals from the skeletal muscles and joints to the cerebellum convey information concerning the status of the muscles and structure being moved during contraction. So, nagbibigay din siya ng signal going back to the cerebellum. Okay? And then the cerebellum compares the information from the motor cortex with the proprioceptive information from the skeletal muscles or joints. And then number 6, okay, so action potentials from the cerebellum of the spinal cord modify the stimulation from the motor cortex to the lower motor neurons. And then action potentials from the cerebellum are sent to the motor cortex to modify its motor activity. And so this is actually how proprioception happens. Next, you have your basal nuclei. So this is a group of functionally related nuclei. It is used for planning, organizing, coordinating motor movements, and of course your posture. It includes a corpus striatum. It is deep in your cerebrum, and you have the substantia nigra, which is found in your midbrain. So this is the basal nuclei. Again, you have what you call your corpus striatum, this one, this part. Okay. And then you have your substantia nigra, this one, in your midbrain. So this is the basal nuclei. Next, for your speech, it is actually mainly in the left hemisphere. Your sensory speech is what you call your Wernicke's area. It is in your parietal lobe. This is where words are heard and comprehended. And then for motor speech, you have your Broca's area. This is found in your frontal lobe, where words are formulated. Okay? So, ito yung sinasabi ko sa inyo kanina, guys, that those kumbaga processes that are being decoded by your brain do have a specific location, no? And they are actually kumbaga they are denoted by different by numbers. Okay, so for example, you have your your Broca's area. They are it can be the area of 40, 45, and 40, 44. And then you have also your pre-auditory area, or for the hearing, like your number 41. 43 is for your gustatory cortex, or for the taste. You also have your Wernicke's area, which is outlined by the dashes, or number 22 in your brain. Primary visual cortex is 17. And then you have your visual associations for 19 and 19. Okay, so most likely more of them are associated with or encoded with a number, depending on the location, and of course depending on the function they do. Okay, so for example, you call it they actually call it like your area 45, like that, area 44, area 5, area 17. What would it be? Okay, so the brain waves and consciousness. So these are used to diagnose and determine the treatment for brain disorders. So electroencephalogram, or EEG, are being used. So these are electrodes plated on the scalp to record brain's electrical activity. So alpha waves, this is present when a person is awake in a quiet state. So next, you have your beta waves for intense mental activity. You have also your delta waves for deep sleep. And then for children, you have your theta waves. And then memory. So memory is for encoding. This is for brief retention of sensory input received by brain while something is scanned, evaluated, and acted up. It is also called your sensory memory. It is found in your temporal lobe, and it lasts less than a second. So for memory, it can be consolidated, wherein data is encoded. It is located in your temporal lobe, and it is short-term memory. It can also be for storage, wherein long-term memory, but for a few minutes or permanently, depends on the ability of a person to retrieve. And then you also have what you call your retrieval. This is how often information is used. Okay, kung palagian mong ginagamit ang information na sinasabi mo. So those are memories of retrieval. Pero kung katulad nito, magkakaroon na tayo ng midterm exam, tingnan natin kung gaano karami ang na-store, okay, sa inyong long-term memory. Okay, so it also depends on you on how you retrieve it. So with memory naman, it is not bad that, for example, you are a type of person na short-term memory. Hindi naman siya abnormal, it's just normal, no? It just depends on how you retrieve things, or how you can go as much go back to the things that you can still remember. Okay, but of course, if there would be problems when it comes to memory, of course there would be underlying conditions, or maybe diseases, or maybe lacking of neurotransmitters that can be found, or that is not already present in your system to be able to help you have good memory or thinking. Kaya nga 'di ba, kapag sa memory, usually meron tayong mga pharmaceutical na mga iniinom, like your memory capsules for, sabi nila nakakapagpa lago ulit ng memory. Okay, siguro meron sa inyo mga ganun yung ginagawa, but for me, I actually do not take it anymore kasi it has side effects on me na nagkakaroon ako minsan ng headache. Parang napupwersa yung utak kong mag-isip palagi. Okay? So, the different types of memory, short-term memory, this information is retained usually for a few seconds or minutes. Bits of information, usually 7. And then for long-term memory, it can last for a few minutes or permanently. You also have episodic memories for remembering places or events. And then, of course, learning utilizing your past memories. And then next, you have your meninges. So meninges are the protective wrapping around your brain and your spinal cord. So if there are bacterial or viral infections of the meninges, of course, it would cause you actually meningitis. So meningitis is actually a very fatal disease, no? Kapag kayo ay nagkaroon ng bacterial or viral infection. So, types of meninges found in your brain would be first your dura mater. This is the superficial layer and the thickest layer among the meninges. And then you have your arachnoid mater. This is the second layer. The pia mater, the third layer. It is already on the surface of the brain. You have the subarachnoid space where cerebrospinal fluid sits. You also have your epidural space. It is in the vertebral column between the dura and vertebra. And then you have injection site for epidural and anesthesia. Okay? So, dito dapat pinapadaan yung anesthesia sa epidural space. And then you also have your spinal block and spinal tap in subarachnoid space where cerebrospinal fluid can be removed or anesthetic inject. And it also numbs your spinal nerves. So, usually ginagamit ng mga spinal block and spinal tap kapag gusto nating ipa-check yung quality or kung gusto nating patignan kung may viral or bacterial infection ka sa meninges mo. Okay, ginagawa to usually sa mga may problema when it comes to the CSF. Okay? So, these are the meninges. You see here the first image as the anterior superior view of your head, and then the second one, the letter B image, is the meningeal membrane surrounding the spinal cord, and then the C image is the cross-section of your vertebra and the spinal cord. So please make sure that you'll be able to memorize and identify the different meninges found in your skull or in your head and your brain. Okay? Even the spaces in your spinal cord. Okay? So next you have your ventricles. These are cavities in the central nervous system that contain fluid. You have here your fourth ventricle. This is found at the base of your cerebellum. It is continuous with your central canal of your spinal cord. So this is the lateral view. So this is the lateral ventricle posterior horn. And then you have the lateral ventricle anterior horn in front. You have the third ventricle here below. And then the lateral ventricle inferior horn. Okay, so you have posterior, anterior, and inferior horns for your lateral ventricles. And then here is your fourth ventricle below. Okay, central canal, fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, and then third ventricle, and of course the lateral ventricles. Next, you have your cranial nerves. There are 12 pair of cranial nerves. They are named by Roman numerals. And there are two categories. It can be sensory or motor. So here you will see the different cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of them. So first, you have your olfactory nerve. Next is your optic nerve 2. You have your oculomotor nerve 3. Trochlear nerve 4, trigeminal nerve 5, abducens nerve is 6, facial nerve is 7, vestibulocochlear nerve is 8, Glossopharyngeal nerve is 9, vagus nerve is 10, hypoglossal nerve is 12, and then accessory nerve is 11. So those are the 12 pairs of your cranial nerves. And make sure that you'll be able to know if their function is motor or sensory. Okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean that um, each cranial nerve do only have one function. Some of them can do both sensory and motor. Okay, so this is actually the summary of the cranial nerves and their functions. So here you see that S means sensory, M is somatic, and then P is a parasympathetic. Okay, so just remember and memorize the numbers, their names, of course, their general function and specific function as well. Right? Next, you have your peripheral nervous system. So it consists of of all neurons outside your brain and spinal cord. It collects input from different sources, relays input to the CNS, and performs action. So the divisions of the peripheral nervous system includes your afferent or sensory. It collects input from the periphery and sends it to the CNS, or the efferent or the motor, which carries processed input from the CNS to the effector. So again, you have the divisions, which can be autonomic. Response is automatic for involuntary. It controls your smooth, cardiac, and glands. It can also be somatic. It is for the response. The response is actually voluntary, and it controls your skeletal muscles. So this is actually the organization of the somatic and the autonomic nervous system neurons in your body. Okay, so here you have the first one, a cell body of the somatic neuron in the CNS, and its axon extends to the skeletal muscles. And then the second one here, we have the cell body of the pre-ganglionic neuron is in the central nervous system, and its axon extends to the autonomic ganglion and synapses with the postganglionic neuron. And then the postganglionic neuron extends to the synapses with its effector organ. So the divisions of the autonomic system, again, you have your sympathetic. So it is activated during times of stress. It's part of the what you call the fight or flight responses, and it prepares you for physical activity by increase of your heart rate, increase of your blood pressure, and increase of your breathing rate. So it's sending more blood to your skeletal muscles. So these are the types of reactions wherein nagugulat kayo, nai-stress kayo, hina-high blood kayo. Okay? So that's what you call the fight or flight response. But when you say parasympathetic, this is housekeeper. It is activated under normal conditions like involved in your digestion, urine production, and dilation or constriction of your pupils. So it's inhibiting digestive tract. Okay, so it actually gives you the normal conditions in your body. So for the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, you have here a summary. So for the sympathetic, you have the preganglionic cell body location from T1 to L2. The location of the postganglionic cell is sympathetic chain ganglia or collateral ganglia. And again, the general function would be fight or flight. So it prepares the body for physical activities. On the other hand, you have your parasympathetic, which includes the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, 10, S2 to S4 spinal nerves, and the location of the postganglionic cell body is found in the terminal ganglia, near or embedded in the walls of the target organs, and its general function is for the rest and digest. It stimulates involuntary activities of the body at rest. Okay? So this is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic effects of that are found in your body. So just be familiar with what are the examples of the sympathetic and parasympathetic situations. So effects of the ANS on various tissues. So again, this one, this is already actually the summary of the different effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic effects depending on the target organs in your body. So just study this table. So for the clinical applications, we have here the representative diseases and disorders of the nervous system. So you have encephalitis, meningitis, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, and then you also have herpes and your poliomyelitis. So for the Parkinson's disease, this is due to the loss of neurons that produce a chemical messenger in your brain you call your dopamine. So when dopamine levels decrease, it causes abnormal brain activity leading to symptoms of your Parkinson's disease. So what the risk factors actually are genes, environmental triggers such as exposure to toxins, presence of Lewy bodies at age around 60 years old, your sex, men are more likely to develop Parkinson's disease. Okay, so when you have Parkinson's disease, if you check on the image on your screen right now, on this substantia nigra, this is the part where it is more likely affected. So healthy substantia nigra makes enough dopamine. So remember that dopamine is made by the substantia nigra, and when this substantia nigra doesn't have enough dopamine, of course the cell nerve dies in the substantia nigra, and so not enough dopamine has been made, so you develop Parkinson's disease. So with a person that has Parkinson's disease, you will see the mask-like face. You have Parkinsonian gait. When you say Parkinsonian gait, guys, yan yung medyo parang nakayuko. Okay? And then your movement is slow, reduced arm swinging, so parang matigas yung muscles. And then asymmetric resting tremor, so laging nanginginig. You also have rigidity. You also have freezing, postural instability, and then shuffling steps. Ito yung parang baby steps na tinatawag. Okay? Next, you have your Alzheimer's disease. So this is a progressive disorder that causes the brain cells to waste away or degenerate and die. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. So before you're being diagnosed to have a dementia, dapat magkaka-Alzheimer's ka muna. Okay? So, magkaiba sila. Usually kasi may ibang tao na nalilito or napagpapareha na pagko-compare na parehas ang Alzheimer's at dementia. Pero hindi. Alzheimer's actually cause dementia. So, it is a continuous decline in thinking, behavioral, and social skills that disrupts a person's ability to function independently. So, it is caused by a combination of genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors that affect the brain over time. So, researchers are focused on the role of two proteins in determining your Alzheimer's disease condition. So, first, you have the presence of your plaques. So, beta amyloid is a leftover fragment of a larger protein. When these fragments cluster together, they appear to have a toxic effect on neurons and to disrupt cell-to-cell communication. This clusters from larger deposits called amyloid plaques, which also include other cellular debris. And then the second one is the presence of tangles. So tau proteins play a part in a neuron's internal support and transport system to carry nutrients and other essential materials. In Alzheimer's disease, tau proteins change shape and organize themselves into structures called neurofibrillary tangles, and the tangles disrupt the transport system and are toxic to the cells. Okay, so in the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, usually doctors and even researchers have proven that they can see plaques and tangles in the neurons of a person which has Alzheimer's disease. So here you can see the comparison of how a healthy brain and an Alzheimer's patient's brain look like. So in a healthy brain, nakikita nyo na napaka-definite ng kanyang gray matter, okay, at healthy. But when it comes to an advanced Alzheimer's disease brain, nakikita nyo na halos wala ng gray matter. More on white matter yung natitira sa kanya. Okay, so here in a normal one, you can still see the sulcus, the gyrus, and then nagkakaroon din na maganda pa yung itsura nung part of the brain that is responsible for language and memory. But for Alzheimer's disease, kung nakikita nyo yung mga sulcus nila, wala masyadong, kumbaga yung spaces nawawala, nagde-generate na yung mga gray matter. And then see the part of the language, diba? Nagde-decrease yung size, or kumbaga in general lumiliit yung brain. Okay, kumpara sa isang healthy brain. So next, you have your multiple sclerosis. This is a potentially disabling disease of the brain and spinal cord. In multiple sclerosis, the immune system attacks the protective sheath or myelin that covers nerve fibers and causes communication problems between your brain and the rest of your body. So eventually, the disease can cause permanent damage or deterioration of the nerves. Okay? So as you see here in the scan, okay, you will see their lesions and yung mga parang white na yan. Okay? So there are lesions that can be found or that can be denoted when a person do have a multiple sclerosis. So ayan ang nangyayari sa kanya, yung kanyang kumbaga yung nerve fiber, di ba, nadadamage yung myelin sheath niya. Ayan. So that's actually what's happening when it comes to multiple sclerosis. So it would actually cause you numbness, tingling, pain below the lesion. So wherever the lesion is, anything below it would be affected. And then next you have here your Huntington's disease. So this is a comparison of your frontal horns of the lateral ventricle. So in a normal brain, nakikita nyo na ganito yung itsura ng normal. But with Huntington's, lumalaki, mas malaki, or nag-enlarge yung mga frontal horns of the lateral ventricle. So with Huntington's disease, it is an inherited disease that causes the progressive breakdown or degeneration of the nerve cells in the brain. Huntington's disease has a broad impact on person's functional abilities and usually results in movement, thinking, and psychiatric disorders. And then it is caused by an inherited defect in a single gene, an autosomal dominant disorder, which means that a person needs only one copy of the defective gene to develop the disorder. So for example, si father affected, si mother unaffected. Syempre kapag ka nagkaroon na ng cross-bridging of the genes, diba? So there would be a possibility that 50% of the child, no, 50% of the total number of the children in the future could have or could be affected by the gene. Okay? And makakapag-produce sila ng Huntington's disease. Next is the Wilson's disease. So in Wilson's disease is a toxic level of copper accumulation and damage of many tissues and organs, including the basal ganglia of the brain. So in Wilson's disease, ganyan yung nangyayari, nagsishrink because of exposure to copper. Lalo na kapag ang trabaho nyo more likely on exposure sa mga toxic elements. And then in this Wilson's disease, you will also see here the feature or if you have the characteristics of having this what you call a Kaeser-Fleischer rings. So kung makikita nyo this sa right side, you have the normal eye. Okay, but here with dun sa letter A, meron siyang parang yung eyeballs niya parang may border. Okay, parang copper color border. So those are the Kaeser-Fleischer rings. So next we have the Gillian Bar Syndrome. This is a rare disorder in which your body's immune system attacks your nerves, and weakness and tingling in your extremities are usually the first symptoms. And these sensations can quickly spread, eventually paralyzing your whole body. So like your multiple sclerosis, parang ganun din si Gillian Bar Syndrome. But then again, what happens is that it's the immune system that attacks. So autoimmune siya. Okay? So it affects the nerves in the brain, in your spinal cord. And then yan, nagkakaroon din ng damage with your myelin sheath. Next is the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or ALS. So the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is a type of motor neuron disease. So an example would be the most famous Stephen Hawking, who was diagnosed in his early 20s. He defied prediction he would only live a few years but was wheelchair bound and spoke through a computerized voice system. So ALS is a rare neurological condition. It is progressive. It worsens with time with no cure. It gradually, or the muscles gradually undergo voluntary control, are affected. Individuals lose strength, ability to speak, eat, and move, and most people with ALS die of respiratory failure within 3 to 5 years of the first symptoms. Okay, so it affects nerve cells responsible for controlling voluntary muscle movement, motor neurons linked between brain and voluntary muscles. In ALS, the upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons degenerate and die, and they are unable to function, and the muscles degenerate. Okay, so ayun guys, kapag ka ang, di ba nga ang muscles, kapag ka hindi nagagamit, lalo na kapag ka mga bedridden, they tend to um, decrease in size, nagsishrink sila, kaya hindi na rin sila napapagana. Okay, so yan, si Stephen Hawking ang pinaka sikat, okay, na merong amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So that actually ends the second part of our nervous system lecture discussion. So if you have questions and if you would like to have clarifications when it comes to this lecture, just let us know. Thank you.